Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the second week of looking at past exam paper questions. This week, the question that I've chosen is this one: evaluate government policies apart from migration policies that could be used to increase the employment rate in the UK. Now, even though this is a 15-mark question, I've almost styled this to be a bit like what a 25-mark question would look like. I'm not going to make a final judgment, which will be a 6th paragraph, but the reason why this is a bit like a 25 marker is that we're not going to use any extracts. So all the application will come from our understanding of what is happening in the UK economy right now. So the question is then, evaluate policies apart from migration policies that could be used to increase the employment rate in the UK. Now it asks for policies, so we would give them 2. So we would have to evaluate 2 different policies. And my advice would be that your answer should be structured in 5 different paragraphs. So paragraph 1 would be basic knowledge. Okay, so you might focus in particular on an understanding of the employment rate. Paragraph 2 would be an explanation of your first policy. So I'd expect to see some application in here. I'd also expect to see potentially a diagram. And what you must do is to link it back to how this policy would increase the employment rate. Paragraph 3 would be an evaluation of that policy. And I've listed here some possible words that you might want to consider when you evaluate. So things such as the extent to which this will happen will depend on. You could think about the short-term against long-term impacts of this. You could explain why it might be difficult to say what the impact of this policy would be. You might link it back to magnitude, which is about the size of the impact. You could think about opportunity costs, which is linking in really with potential conflicts with other macroeconomic objectives. Again, you could think about time lags, which again, will it benefit in the short term or long term? Will it be a significant impact? And then you've got words such as however or on the other hand that you could be using as well. Now, in paragraph 4, it's the same as paragraph 2. You would give a second policy, and you would explain how that policy could be used to increase the employment rate. And then finally, in paragraph 5, you would evaluate that second policy. So I'm going to give you roughly what my answer would look like for this question. Okay, so we'd start off in paragraph 1 with a little bit of knowledge. So I'm just going to get across what we mean by the employment rate. So the employment rate is the proportion of the population of working age in full or part-time work. So we're not looking at how many hours people work here, what work people do. We're simply looking at the people in the economy who are working. So you've got some data here which gives you an idea of the UK employment rate. So this first one here, this diagram is showing us that the employment rate in the UK economy, the most recent bit of data, is roughly just over 75%. So just over 75% of people in the UK of working age are working in the economy. Now what that means then is that we've got about 25% of people of working age who are not currently employed. Now obviously the main reason why this could be is because they're unemployed. So if you're unemployed, you're still part of the workforce, but you're not working. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the economic inactivity. So these are people also of working age who, for whatever reason, are not either employed nor unemployed in the economy. So you've got students, so again, people of working age who are maybe in full-time education, people at university, that type of thing. You've got people who maybe are looking after family. So, this could be people looking after children or elderly relatives. You could have stay-at-home people. You've got people in sickness, which could be temporary or long-term. A small number of people, it's worth noting nonetheless, is discouraged workers. So people who, for whatever reason, has chosen not to work. You've got the people who might be early retired. And then there are other reasons as well that could mean that people choose not to work in the economy. So overall, the big sort of takeaway point from this then is that if you want to increase the employment rate, you've got to reduce unemployment and you've got to somehow reduce economic inactivity. Now, all I would put in this first paragraph then, if it was me, would be that the employment rate, it measures the proportion of the population of working age who are in full or part-time work. I might then say that the current UK employment rate is just over 75%. And if we want to increase the employment rate, we've got to reduce unemployment and/or we've got to reduce the number of people who are economically inactive. So reduce economic inactivity and/or reduce the unemployment rate. Now on this next slide here, you've got some possible policies that you might want to focus on. So we've got here government policies. Now governments, remember, can control fiscal policy, but also supply side policies. So fiscal is about adjusting government spending and/or taxes. Supply side policies are designed to create potential economic growth. And remember, these can be either interventionist, which requires the government to step up its role in the workings of the economy, or it could be free market. So bringing in a policy which will encourage more supply and demand decision making. Now you've got here, I've listed 3, 4, 5, 7 different policies that you could talk about. You would pick 2 of these. So we could go for investments into education and training. We could go for increases in minimum wage rates. You could even argue, if you wanted to, a reduction in minimum wage rates. You could lower unemployment benefits. We could do some kind of incentives for businesses, so grants, subsidies, or reductions in corporate taxes. We could lower income tax as a way of incentivising more people to work. We could make childcare more accessible or more affordable to incentivise more people to want to work or make it more able for people to work. Then what we can also do is to increase labour market flexibility. So if you make it easier for firms to hire and fire people, it does generally create more job creation opportunities for enterprises across the economy. Now anyway, in my answer, I clearly wouldn't focus on these 7 different ideas. So what I'm going to do in my answer, I'm going to be looking at, and I'll highlight these, something linked to the minimum wage. And I'm also going to talk about what we can do to incentivise businesses to create more jobs as well. So I've just chosen 2 policies that I'm fairly confident I could evaluate to a really, really good standard to get as many marks as possible. Now, before we move on, an understanding of the employment rate and an identification of my 2 policies is going to demonstrate knowledge. That's all I've done at this moment in time. I've identified policies that could technically increase the employment rate. To get the application and the analysis marks, I've now got to explain how these policies would raise the employment rate in the UK economy. To pick up the evaluation marks, I've got to then be considering counterbalances or counter arguments to those points that I've made. Right, now here's my first policy. I'll highlight these as and when I get to them. So I'm going to say for my first policy that I'm going to be looking to reduce corporate tax rates across the economy. Remember, corporate tax is a tax on business profits, but I'm going to adjust them in a way that would incentivise businesses to set up in parts of the country that have suffered from deindustrialisation. So in class recently, we've been looking at globalisation. And what we know is that certain parts across the country have been suffering from deindustrialisation. So moving a little bit here into my example. So what we know is in Kirklees, there used to be a huge textile industry. We know in Yorkshire, there used to be a huge steel industry. In the north of England, we also had other big industries and things such as shipbuilding as well. Now, what we know is because of international trade, these regions across the country have lost absolute and comparative advantages in production, which means the production is often shifted overseas. And that has led to lots of structural unemployment. So we've got then, across the north of England in deindustrialised hotspots, higher unemployment rates, maybe higher rates of economic inactivity. So I want to bring in a policy that would in theory incentivise businesses to relocate to these parts across the country and create jobs and base production in these regions across our economy. So if I was giving you my answer here, then what I'd be saying is this. My policy would be to reduce corporate tax rates in a way that would incentivise firms to set up in areas in the country that have experienced deindustrialisation. And if I move into my example, this would be areas in the UK, such as the north of England, that have seen manufacturing industries decline. I can now link in my diagram to the right hand side. This lower corporate tax rate would incentivise more UK firms, but also more foreign firms, to want to invest into the UK economy. This would mean that the LRAS curve would shift outwards. And what you can see from the diagram is that when the LRAS moves outwards, we get to potential economic growth, then there will also be an increase in the output of the economy. Now, clearly, if you raise the output of the economy, there'll be a growing need for workers, which would boost employment levels across the economy. So look what I've done, everyone, in my analysis. I've linked it back to how it could reduce structural unemployment. So what we know is in the north of England, for example, we've got people that find it difficult to work as deindustrialisation happens due to a lack of transferable skills to new industries. They maybe can't afford to relocate to where the jobs are. So we're going to bring in a policy which will take the jobs to the people. So this policy will tackle immobility of labour, incentivise investment which creates potential economic growth. That will raise output due to the growth in GDP created in these economies. So I want to make sure here that at the end that we mention these different keywords. I've already mentioned it encourages foreign direct investment. It could lead to multinationals wanting to move to the economy, but you've got to make sure that you link it back to the question. So clearly explain how this policy would increase the employment rate of the economy. So if I was to give you a run through now with no additional explanation, I would say, well, overall, the policy that I would use would be to reduce corporate tax rates. This will be done in a way which would incentivise businesses, both domestic and foreign, to set up in areas of our economy that have suffered from deindustrialisation. For example, Sheffield used to have a huge steel industry. As the industry declined due to international trade theory, it's created lots of structural unemployment. So if we can get firms to go and base production in Sheffield, it will create more job opportunities for these people. This would therefore create potential economic growth, shift out the LRAS curve, and raise the need for workers in a part of the country with high immobility of labour problems. Now, if I was thinking about evaluation, you've got this problem. Will a tax cut be significant enough to increase investment into deprived areas? So what I'm suggesting is that a lower corporate tax rate might not be enough of an incentive for businesses to go to want to relocate to these areas. So what it might need is additional incentives to get these firms to go to these areas. So it might need extra government support to develop skills of workers. That might be essential to tackle occupational immobility of labour. And we might also need to see lots of investment into physical capital. So I'm looking here at infrastructure such as road networks, other transport links, access to good broadband connections, etc. Now, if these things aren't in place, the lower corporate tax rate will not be enough of an incentive to get these firms to relocate there. If we need all this extra government spending alongside of it, you would argue it's not affordable for the government given the current high levels of national debt, especially since it's been built up significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've got that a clear evaluation. It might not be enough. So if it's not going to be enough, then it's clearly not going to significantly raise the employment rate in our economy. Now, the second point that I'm going for is a very controversial one, especially at the moment, given that inflation is already quite high in this economy. So my second policy would be to increase the national minimum wage. This would hopefully make work more attractive. Now, you can see my diagram on the right-hand side. I've drawn you the minimum wage diagram. So I've identified that the current minimum wage is £8.91 in our economy. So what I'm going to suggest we do is we raise the minimum wage rate above the current £8.91. Now, what this will do, it would incentivise an extension in the supply of labour. So what we know is we've got a lot of people who are economically inactive. So if you were to increase wage rates, you may incentivise more of these people to try and seek employment in our economy. Now that at the moment is really, really important given the fact that we've got across the economy lots and lots of labour shortages. So if I was explaining this point then, let me now highlight the point, the evidence and the analysis. I could say, well, my policy could be to increase the national minimum wage rate. This would raise the minimum wage rate from the current £8.91 level for over 23s. We can see from the diagram, this would incentivise an extension in the supply of labour. The reason this would happen is it would reduce the opportunity cost of working. So the idea is that when you go to work, you obviously generate an income, and the opportunity cost of working is that loss of leisure time. So if you're now compensated more for working, you're more likely to want to do it. You can even argue for many people who may be economically inactive, it may incentivise them to want to work because it might justify higher transport costs or childcare issues. So it may hopefully reduce economic inactivity. It will hopefully as well reduce frictional unemployment. Remember, frictional unemployment is people that are between jobs. So this might speed up job search as people want to get these higher rates of pay as quickly as possible. So we're going to create an extension in the supply of labour through that increase in wage rates. But then an evaluation. Let me highlight this bottom paragraph now. This is really dangerous because in the economy at the moment, we've already got cost push inflationary pressures. So firms are already experiencing higher fuel prices. There's higher shipping costs going on. Well, if you now make businesses pay higher wage rates, it's going to add to cost push inflationary pressures. It's going to make the SRAS shift inwards. So you've therefore got a conflict with other macroeconomic objectives. Now, in theory, what this might then lead to is a wage price spiral. If you raise business costs due to higher wages, then firms need to respond by raising prices. Can the economy take any additional inflation that could be taking place in the economy? It's also worth remembering as well that when you increase minimum wage rates, it will contract the demand for labour. So you might have more people that are willing and able to work, but you're going to have fewer businesses being willing and able to recruit workers. So you've got more people engaged in job search, but you could technically have less people employed. Well, that could in theory lower the employment rate. So there you've got a bit of a conflict there again between these different objectives across the economy. So overall, guys, to wrap it up, paragraph 1 was getting across an understanding of what the employment rate is. So the proportion of the population of working age engaged in full or part-time work. We've got there a little bit of knowledge. We were then bringing our policies. So my 2 policies were to give more tax incentives to firms to set up in areas across the country with high unemployment rates, but then secondly, to increase the minimum wage rate. So for my first policy, I talked about how corporate tax rate reductions would incentivise more investment, more foreign direct investment, lead to more MNCs operating across your economy. It would create potential economic growth, especially with targeted parts of the country with high structural unemployment. I've linked it back to how this would increase the employment rate, more output, more jobs, etc. But then the evaluation was, well, actually, for these firms, it's not just about the corporate tax rates. We've got to look at the quality of the human and physical capital as well. Can governments afford to expand spending in those areas? Second policy, increase minimum wage rates. It will incentivise an extension in supply of labour. You've got more people now prepared to work, could reduce economic inactivity. But then the evaluation was, well, actually, it's dangerous. It adds to already quite high inflation in our economy. So you've got that clear conflict with other macroeconomic objectives. It can create wage price spirals, and it could overall even lower the demand for labour. But if that happens, it would actually reduce the employment rate across the economy. Right, anyway, well, I hope you found that useful. I will now sign off. Thank you very much.